To be granted a military triumph through the streets of Rome was the greatest honour a Roman general could receive. Dressed in kingly garments, riding in a chariot drawn by 4 horses, the general would lead his victorious army through the streets before cheering crowds, exhibiting the spoils and captives of war, all the way to the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. It was a day of celebration for the entire city, and one of immense pride for the general personally. Exactly how a general went about receiving the honour of a triumph is not entirely clear. Some form of military success was an obvious requirement, and for a general to be hailed as imperator or victorious general by his troops was often seen as the first step in achieving one. It was then up to the general to claim his triumph, and for this he would have to campaign not with the sword, but with the pen. The first step involved sending a formal letter, apparently decorated in laurel, to the Senate back in Rome, in which he outlined the details of his victory, no doubt adding a little embellishment along the way. He may well have requested a triumph from the Senate directly, or more likely had a political ally propose one on his behalf. Success largely came down to having influential friends in the Senate. Roman generals were almost always drawn from the senatorial elite, and so it was from his peers that a general sought a triumph. Promises were made, bribes handed out, past favours called in, while allies were mobilised and rivals flattered. Marcus Tullius Cicero later claimed to have written to every member of the Senate but 2, well over 600 people, when pushing for his own triumph in 51 BC. He wrote to one consul,
"So I earnestly beg that you make sure a decree is passed, in the most honorific terms possible, concerning my achievements, and as soon as possible too."
Being granted a period of thanksgiving by the Senate was a good first sign, an indication that it was largely supportive, or at least sympathetic. A thanksgiving, or supplicatio, was a public holiday dedicated to the general, and greatly enhanced his prestige. Throughout Rome, temple doors were opened, and their resident gods put on public display, allowing people to visit and offer prayers of thanks for delivering a victory. Typically, a thanksgiving would last for 3 to 5 days, though we increasingly hear of some lasting much longer. At some point, the general would return to Rome to formally request a triumph from the Senate in person, camping with his army, captives and spoils on the field of Mars to the northwest of the city. There was, however, one important detail. A general was not allowed to cross the Pomerium, Rome's sacred city boundary. If he did so, he would no longer be considered a military commander, but a private citizen instead. His imperium, the authority that gave him the legal right to command troops, would evaporate, along with his right to triumph. As the Senate house lay within this sacred city boundary, it was necessary to request an audience in an alternative venue. The Temple of Bellona, goddess of war, which was situated just outside the Pomerium, was a large enough and convenient, not to mention appropriate place for the Senate to convene. These debates could drag on for months as envious rivals looked to frustrate the general's request for a triumph every step of the way. Ultimately, having powerful and influential friends in the Senate determined the outcome. If a triumph was awarded by the Senate, this decision would need ratifying by a vote in the People's Assembly. But the general had little to fear. Who didn't want to see a triumph, after all? A successful vote in the People's Assembly gave the general a legal and temporary imperium within Rome's sacred city boundary for the day or days of the triumph. The triumphing general, the Triumphator, dressed to resemble the ancient Etruscan kings of Rome, or possibly even the king of the gods. He wore a purple tunic embroidered with gold palm leaves, the tunica palmata, and a majestic purple and gold toga, the toga picta, over this. Around his neck he wore a lucky charm, a bulla, to protect him from evil. On his head was a laurel crown, and, in his hands, an eagle-topped sceptre and palm branch, the very symbol of victory. His face was painted red, in imitation of the terracotta statue of Jupiter, king of the gods. The Triumphator would ride in a large gold triumphal chariot called a quadriga, which was drawn by 4 pure white horses. His young children could accompany him in the chariot, or ride alongside on a horse if they were older. Behind the Triumphator stood a slave, holding a golden crown of oak leaves above the general's head, and reminding him repeatedly that he was mortal, perhaps to remind the general not to get too carried away. Long before the crowd caught sight of the triumphing general, they were treated to a dazzling display as the spoils of war were paraded through the streets. We hear of endless trails of carts loaded with gold and silver bullion and coins, chests of pearls and gemstones, statues made of marble or precious metals, rich fabrics, jewellery and plates, war machines, beaks of enemy ships, captured weapons and armour, ivory tusks, exotic trees and peculiar animals. And scattered amongst these spoils were paintings and models depicting the battles fought, the cities captured, and the land conquered, giving a sense of where and how the items on display were obtained. Also on display were the unfortunate captives, but just how many were paraded as part of a triumph is a mystery. Most captives would probably have been sold into slavery close to the war zone, with only the strongest and most impressive prisoners being kept aside for the triumph back in Rome. More important was the status of the prisoners themselves, with captured kings and queens dressed in their native garments drawing the most attention. In fact, we hear some stories of these prisoners having an unintended impact. In 120 BC, for example, the captured Gallic king Bituitus, riding in his silver war chariot, completely stole the stage during the triumph of Fabius Maximus. On another occasion, in 167 BC, during the triumph of Lucius Aemilius Paulus, the sight of King Perseus of Macedon walking with his young children as prisoners reduced the crowd to tears, as did the pitiful sight of the young Egyptian queen Arsinoe carried on a float in the triumph of Gaius Julius Caesar in 46 BC. Behind the displays, spoils, animals and captives came the Triumphator himself. He would be accompanied by family and friends, his lictors carrying the fasces, the symbol of his authority, and of course his troops. For the triumph, the soldiers were unarmed, wearing laurel crowns and military decorations, chanting Io Triumphe and singing crude songs about their general. Such was Roman humour. The precise route of the triumph presumably varied over time as Rome's cityscape changed, but it seems likely that it generally followed a similar path. The starting point of the triumph was on the Field of Mars to the northwest of the city. The procession would then weave its way towards the so-called Triumphal Gate at the foot of the Capitoline Hill, and cross Rome's sacred city boundary, the Pomerium. Moving across the Forum Boarium, the procession would pass the Temple of Hercules and a large statue of the demigod himself, which was dressed in triumphal clothing for the occasion. It would then enter the Circus Maximus, packed with as many as 150,000 spectators. Exiting the stadium at its opposite end, the procession would then make its way around the eastern side of the Palatine Hill and onto Rome's main street, the Sacred Way, or Sacra Via, towards the Forum at the heart of the city. As the Triumph entered the Forum, most of the spoils were probably deposited in the Temple of Saturn, which acted as Rome's state treasury, with the general's quaestor handing over a full report. Many of the prisoners were most likely taken away to be sold into slavery, while the high-profile captives were taken to the nearby prison, the Tullianum, where they were executed. This was the fate of the Numidian king Jugurtha during the triumph of Gaius Marius in 104 BC, and of the Gallic king Vercingetorix during the triumph of Julius Caesar in 46 BC. In some cases, however, we hear of these celebrity captives being placed under house arrest. According to one account, Perseus of Macedon was settled in a comfortable villa in central Italy, while Arsinoe was sent to serve as a priestess at the temple of Artemis in Ephesus. The culmination of the triumph took place at the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, king of the gods, on the summit of the Capitoline Hill, which overlooked the Forum. Here, the Triumphator would preside over a sacrifice of 2 white bulls, with gilded horns and draped in flowers. He may then have dedicated the palm branch as a symbol of victory to Jupiter himself. Only 3 times in Rome's history did a general ever dedicate the so-called spoils of honour, the spolia opima, in the nearby temple of Jupiter Feretrius. The spolia opima were the armour and weapons of an enemy commander, and could only be dedicated if he had been killed in single combat by the Triumphator himself. Despite all of these opportunities for glory, however, humiliation for the triumphing general was an ever-present danger. During his first triumph in 81 BC, the young and overconfident Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, or Pompey the Great, had insisted on having his chariot drawn by 4 elephants, only to find to his horror during the procession that they were too big to squeeze through one of the gates along the route. There followed an awkward pause while the elephants were replaced with horses. Julius Caesar, during his first triumph in 46 BC, had almost been thrown to the ground when the axle on his chariot broke. That this incident occurred in front of the temple of Fortuna, goddess of luck, appeared to be a bad omen to the superstitious Roman crowd. In an attempt to appease the gods, Caesar supposedly climbed the steps to the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on his knees. The triumph ended with huge feasts and entertainments that were laid out across the city at the general's expense. The Triumphator was joined by members of the Senate, as well as close family and friends, on the Capitoline Hill, possibly in the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus itself. Consuls traditionally declined the invite so as not to outrank the Triumphator. Citizens were meanwhile treated in the Forum Boarium, and perhaps in the main Forum too. As for the soldiers, they received a generous bonus calculated according to their rank, and could forever boast of marching in a triumph. The following day, with the triumph over, the imperium of the Triumphator evaporated, and the clean-up began. But his achievement lived on. A laurel wreath was displayed above the entrance of his home, possibly made of stone, and he was permitted to wear his triumphal crown and toga on special occasions, at games and at festivals. In the long term, memories of the triumph may be seen on coins or in the very buildings that stood across Rome, as triumphing generals poured their spoils into the construction of public works and temples. Pompey the Great famously oversaw the construction of Rome's first stone theatre, complete with a temple to Venus Victrix, a porticoed garden, and a brand new Senate house. To be granted a triumph was the greatest honour a Roman general could receive, and often marked the high point of his political and military career. Such an achievement added to his own prestige and enhanced the reputation of the family name. Simply having a Triumphator amongst your ancestors may in some cases be enough to kickstart a successful political career. Ultimately, the ambition of every Roman general to march through the streets of Rome in triumph came to an end along with the Republic. From then on, only the emperor and members of his close family were ever permitted to triumph. It was not in the emperor's best interest to have a potential rival parading his achievements before the people. Instead, the emperor gradually acquired the aura of a triumphing general permanently. He wore the purple and gold toga picta and the laurel crown, and was always addressed as imperator, from which we get the word emperor. And, as a permanent reminder of the emperor's greatness, so-called triumphal arches, like those of the emperors Titus, Septimius Severus, and Constantine, were raised at various locations along the processional route of the triumph. From now on, every victory, no matter where it was achieved or under whose command, was attributed to the person of the emperor.